We'll start with Phylum Mollusca. This is a huge phylum. It's actually the largest phylum of all marine animals, over 93,000 known species. And because mollusks tend to have shells, we see them a lot in the fossil record because they fossilize really well. So we see a lot of their evolutionary history. The word mollusk actually refers to the fact that it has what we call kind of a head-foot body type. So the body is sort of one big lump or mass with all of its organs inside. And in a lot of cases, the head and the foot tend to be kind of the same part. In fact, the word cephalopod, which is one group within mollusca, literally means head-foot. So it's sort of an interesting characteristic of most mollusks. Another important characteristic, the visceral mass that makes up the body. So the body of a mollusk is pretty much one, like I said, sort of one glob of organs. And that visceral mass is basically kind of like your torso, the bulk of your body. All mollusks have a hard part of some kind, whether it's a shell on the outside or in the case of squid, there's a pen, which is a small, thin, hard piece that runs through it. The exception is the octopus that actually does not have a hard part, although it does have a beak, so there are, I guess you could say that's a hard part, but that's not quite the same as a shell or a pen. So the visceral mass is covered by a thin layer called the mantle. It's kind of a dense, thin piece that is what creates the shell. So it's what runs over the top, in this case here of the snail, runs over the top of the body. And so this is what secretes the shell. What a lot of mollusks have is a little feeding appendage here called the radula. So snails have this, for example, and the radula is almost like a little conveyor belt of little sharp teeth. And that thing will move and scrape along the bottom. So like when you see a snail or a slug moving along the sidewalk, maybe after it's rained, they're scraping their little radula along the ground and they pick up algae that way. So it's like a little conveyor belt as they move along. We see that in some mollusks. We don't see that in bivalves, so you don't see that in clams, oysters, mussels. Those are examples of bivalves, so it's a little different. And about their symmetry, which will be important when we put them on the cladogram, mollusks have bilateral symmetry. So what that means, again, is that if you could divide them straight down the middle and it would be equal symmetry on both sides, just like us. And it may not look that way, but trust me, they actually do have that symmetry. So we'll see more of that. So here's some of their basic parts. I won't go over all of them, but you can get a sense of some of the familiar organs, the heart, part of the circulatory system, the stomach, the reproductive system. They have a very, very basic nervous system here. So here's the nerve cords. So this is, again, an example of a snail or a slug. But when we look at like an octopus or a squid, we're going to see a slightly different body plan. So the shell is pretty amazing. There's actually a couple different layers that make up the shell, and I'll show you in the diagram here in just a second. There's an outermost layer, the periostracum, that's the sort of a thick protein layer. The middle layer, which is sort of the thickest or the bulk of the shell, is the prismatic layer. And then the nacreous layer is the very, very thin sheets of calcium carbonate on the inside. But if you've ever found a shell at the beach, or maybe you have a collection of shells, you might see this sort of shiny, really pretty interior to some of them. And they call that the mother of pearl layer. And so that's basically the innermost lining of the shell. And so it's not listed as number 3, or I'm sorry, it's not listed as number 4 because not all mollusks have it. But it's something that we do sometimes see. So inside of a clam or inside of an abalone. So this is basically if you were to cut the shell in half, this is what you would see. Here's the mantle here. So the mantle is what secretes, it gives off and makes the calcium carbonate, which builds up the shell. So here's the nacreous layer, the prismatic layer, which is the thickest part, and then the periostracum, which is the thin protein on the outside. So again, in the fossil record, we see a lot of them because they tend to fossilize really well. And so we see, here's a couple examples here of ancient mollusks that are now extinct, but they're the ancestors to the mollusks that we see today. So we're going to go through each class in this phylum, and I do want you to know some characteristics of each class. The first class are called polyplacophora, poly meaning multiple, and then the placo refers to the little plates on the organism's back. And so this is a class, the most well-known organisms are called chitons. And you may have seen these before, maybe especially if you live on the West Coast, you find these a lot in the rocky intertidal. And they're small, kind of flat organisms. They almost look like those roly-poly or pill bugs or potato bugs. Everybody calls them something different depending on where you're from. They look a little bit like that. They're not actually related to them very closely at all, but they look similar. And so these dorsal plates go on the dorsal side or the top side of the animal, and it can roll up a little bit just like a potato bug. The underside or the ventral side, you see this is the muscular foot. So again, that's an important characteristic of mollusks. The mouth is right here, and it has a little radula in there. So these guys will actually attach onto rocks really well. So this big visceral mass in here has this foot on the outside. So the ventral foot is the part that looks kind of like a skirt, and they can actually suck onto rocks and stay stuck really well. So that's how they survive an environment that's often pounded by waves and really harsh. So anyway, that's chitons, and again, they make up Polyplacophora. Here's a few varieties here. Another class we'll look at, these are called scaphopods or class Scaphopoda. So these guys have long, kind of a tube-shaped shell. Some people say it looks like those macaroni noodles that are long and tube-shaped. And these guys we see a lot of in the fossil record for sure, but we do see them today as well. So there are plenty of them that are alive now. So this is what its body's like, it has this long tube shape. These guys burrow, they're burrowers, so they dig down into the sand. They have an in-current siphon here where water comes in through the top, circulates, and they draw nutrients out of the water. And then the bottom part is sort of a little bit wider here, and so the visceral mass is contained in the shell. The muscular foot is this part that you see at the bottom, and oftentimes they might even have tentacles that help to anchor them down in the sediment. So the tentacles' purpose is just to hold them in, like kind of like roots on a plant. Okay, so that's class Scaphopoda. Gastropoda, this is a huge class. This will be more familiar to you. This is basically snails and slugs, and this is one of the largest classes of mollusk as well. Huge range of sizes. Some of them are really, really tiny. You've probably found some really tiny snails before, and some of them can be enormous. They can be several feet long. These guys have a single shell, and they're actually coiled up inside. So even though they have bilateral symmetry, you look at this and you think, well, that just looks like a messy jumble. That can't have symmetry. It actually does if you were to, I guess, unwind it. But the snail, for example, this would be a common land snail that you see outside. Its body coils up inside the shell, and its mantle, again, is the thing that creates the shell. So these shells are created by the mantle that the organism has. These guys do have the foot, so the muscular foot is outside here, outside of the shell. And on, for example, this is a type of whelk. You would see the muscular foot tucked up inside. And with animals like these, with whelks and conchs, they often have this little, almost like a trapdoor called an operculum. And it's a thin, very, very thin, very hard piece that's attached to the muscular foot. And they can stick it out and actually use it as like a little weapon. And so it's a nice little trapdoor to keep them safe inside, but they can also use it to strike with, which is kind of cool. And so those are some of the key things about a gastropod. So even the word gastropod means one shell, refers to its single shell. And so gastropods have the one shell with their body coiled up inside. Some other key parts, we talked about the operculums, the little trapdoor. If we want to talk about the terminology of the shell itself, the very, very, very top of the shell is the spire. So the little spirals you see as the shell gets tinier and tinier towards the top is the spire. And then the body whorl would be the large main portion, like the main chamber. The aperture is actually the opening where the operculum is found. So that's just a little bit of terminology for you. The apex would be the very top of the spire. So this just kind of covers that terminology a little bit more. These guys, as far as food goes, they can be herbivores, carnivores, scavengers, or filter feeders. So they have a lot of niches that they fill. They have that little radula. So gastropods typically have that little conveyor belt of teeth. They either use it for algae or they might use it actually as part of a way to attack another animal. Some of them have a long proboscis, and that's like a long tube mouth that they stick out, and they can actually, some of them can spit out a very strong acid that will bore a hole in another type of mollusk. So like in this case here, this person's holding a clam shell, and that little clam had some sort of a carnivorous gastropod make a hole in the shell, and then it sticks its little proboscis through the shell and sucks out the meaty part of the prey. So it's pretty harsh, pretty intense. Sometimes they'll even use their muscular foot to try to pry open a bivalve. So these can be definitely quite aggressive little snails sometimes. So a close-up look at the radula at work here. So here's some algae. The snail sees the delicious algae. It sticks out the little. It's kind of like a tongue. If you guys have cats, you know cats' tongues are kind of rough and even spiky. That's what the radula is a little bit like. Now, there are some gastropods that actually have no shell, which sounds kind of like a contradiction. But these are called nudibranchs, and they're actually really beautiful little gastropods. Sea slugs is what they're called. And some of them are really brightly colored. They can be free swimming. They're pretty awesome. So these are one category of gastropod. How they reproduce, they're separate genders, although some are hermaphroditic. So some of them can be can change gender or can fertilize themselves and do both. Sometimes fertilization happens inside the female, or other times they just secrete their gametes into the water and fertilization occurs there. This is a fun fact. Some types of gastropods actually have this fight where there's two hermaphroditic gastropods and they both extend out their penises and joust. And I'm not even making this up. They will actually fight with their penises, and the loser has to be the female and bear the eggs and have the babies. So it's kind of one of those crazy things in the animal kingdom. So that's kind of a fun fact about some gastropods. So the next class are bivalves, and bivalves is clams, oysters, mussels, and scallops. So bi meaning two, valve meaning the shell. So these are the organisms that have two shells. And so two-part shell, it has a little hinge and it opens and closes. I'll let you look at the parts on the inside here. Again, same body parts. Here's the foot that can stick out through the shell. These guys have no head and no radula. So these guys actually eat more by filter feeding. They suck in water through an inhalant or incurrent siphon and then spit out water through the exhalant siphon. So if you've ever gone digging for clams before and you see them kind of spit water up out of the mud, that's what they're doing. They're shooting water out of their siphon. They're very well adapted to different habitats. So some burrow, some attach to substrate. So like rock pilings, you'll see a lot of mussels and oysters attached to them. The way they do that, they actually secrete a little protein called a byssus, and that protein is kind of, it almost looks like a spider's web, and it anchors them onto a substrate or a rock or something, whatever they're attaching to, the bottom of boats even. Scallops actually move by way of jet propulsion, and you'll see on this page there's actually a video at the bottom where you see them, and it's actually pretty adorable to watch. Some can actually bore holes into things, just like the type of gastropods that do the same thing. So unlike gastropods, these guys are always separate sexes. So bivalves are always separate gender, and they're pretty easy. They just secrete, they put their gametes out in the water, and that's where fertilization occurs. Larvae tends to be free swimming and then eventually grows a shell and settles. And since we only have a minute left, I will save the cephalopods for the next video.